There is a number that the people who run Manchester's water would rather you did not sit with for too long: 62%. That is roughly how full the reservoir system feeding the city fell in the summer of 2025. A network built to run close to the brim sitting at barely 2/3. And 62% does not even tell the worst of it. Because Haweswater itself, the single biggest store in that system, dropped under half full against around 90% at the same point a year before. In one dry spring and one hot summer, the lake that keeps the city alive lost 1/3 of itself, and United Utilities became the first water company in all of England to declare drought. Now, it has come back since then. A wet autumn and a wet winter refilled it, and by the spring of 2026, the whole country was officially out of drought. If you only look at the surface today, you might think the scare is over. But the thing sitting underneath that rise has not changed at all, and that is the part that should worry you. To understand what is really happening at Haweswater, you have to start with what the valley shows you when the water pulls back. Haweswater is the highest and most easterly lake in the Lake District. A long, narrow finger of water tucked into the fells of Cumbria, about 4 miles end to end, half a mile across, and roughly 200 feet deep at its deepest. When the level drops, a pale line appears along both shores, a tide mark scoured into the rock and grass where the water used to sit. And below that line, as the reservoir keeps falling, things start to rise out of the mud. Dry stone walls, stone gateposts standing in open air, tree stumps, a humpbacked packhorse bridge, the straight, pale scar of an old road running down into the water and out the other side. People call it the Lake District Atlantis. And when it surfaces, the valley turns into a place of pilgrimage. Walkers drive for hours to stand on a road that is normally 60 feet underwater. Because what they are walking through is not a natural feature of the lake, it is a village. And the village has a name. Before any of this was a reservoir, the Valley of Mardale held 2 farming hamlets, Mardale Green and Measand. The lake at the bottom of the valley was a real lake, a natural one, split almost in two by a tongue of land at Measand into a larger stretch called High Water, and a smaller one called Low Water. Around the shore sat about a dozen houses, farms that had been worked for 500 or 600 years, a school founded in 1713, an inn called the Dun Bull, and a small medieval church called Holy Trinity that could seat about 75 people. Every autumn, the valley hosted the Mardale Shepherd's Meet, where the fell farmers brought down the stray sheep that had wandered between flocks over the summer, sorted them by ear tags and wool marks, and turned the whole thing into a day of wrestling and horse racing and drinking at the Dun Bull. It was, by every account from the time, one of the most secluded and beautiful corners of Old Westmoreland. And here is where the real digging begins. Because what happened to Mardale was not an accident. It was a decision. In 1919, Parliament passed the Manchester Corporation Act, and that act handed the city of Manchester the legal power to dam the Mardale Valley and flood it. The reason was simple, and it was the same reason that has driven water projects everywhere. Manchester was growing fast. By 1931, the city held more than 751,000 people, and every one of them needed water to drink, to cook, to wash, and to run the mills and factories that made Manchester what it was. The deep glacial valleys of the Lake District, with their high rainfall and their natural bowls of rock, looked like the perfect place to store it. The plan was straightforward on paper: dam the valley, raise the water, pipe it south to the city. Sounds reasonable. Sounds like progress. Except for the people who actually lived in the valley. There was a furious public outcry. The fell writer Alfred Wainwright, who first walked into Mardale in 1930, protested bitterly about what was about to be lost, and he was far from alone. Many people argued that a valley this beautiful should simply be left as it was. But the city needed the water, and the project went ahead anyway. So from the start, this was a story about a city taking what it needed from a place that could not fight back. What happened next is hard to read even now. The villagers were evicted and relocated to surrounding towns. The buildings were pulled down. The school, founded in 1713, was carefully taken apart and rebuilt on higher ground by a private donor. But the rest of the village got no such gentle treatment. The Royal Engineers moved in and used the abandoned farms and houses as live practice, blowing them up to test a new plastic explosive for the War Office. One building, Measand Hall, had stood so solidly for centuries that it actually resisted the new explosive and had to be brought down the hard way. And then there was the church. In August of 1935, Holy Trinity held its final service. The church seated 75, but hundreds of people came, so many that the service had to be ticketed, and the hymns chosen for that last morning included the old line about lifting one's eyes up to the hills. Then the church was taken apart stone by stone, and many of those stones were carried down and built into the draw-off tower of the new reservoir, so that a piece of the church would stand in the water that drowned it. The dead were moved too. Around 100 coffins were dug up from the churchyard and reburied in the ground at Shap, a few miles away, because not even the graves could be left where the water was going to rise. Once the firing stopped and the village was rubble, the flooding began. The wall that did all of this was, for its time, a genuine marvel of engineering. When work started in 1929, the design was at the cutting edge of civil engineering, because Haweswater Dam was the world's first large hollow buttress dam, built from 44 separate buttressed units joined together by flexible joints, stretching about 470 meters, roughly 1,540 feet, across the floor of the valley. It raised the level of the old natural lake by about 95 feet, swallowing high water, low water, the villages, the church, the inn, the school, the road, and the bridge under a single new sheet of water. The reservoir was completely flooded by 1935 and fully online a few years later, and when it filled, Haweswater became the largest man-made lake in the Lake District, bigger than nearby Thirlmere, holding around 84 billion litres, about 18.6 billion gallons, of water. And for the better part of a century, that water has flowed south to keep a city running. Today, Haweswater supplies roughly a quarter of all of northwest England's water. So this is not just a pretty lake with a sad history, it is a machine. And to understand the danger, you have to follow where that machine sends its water. And here is the part that changes the whole story. Haweswater does not pipe its water to Manchester through some modern, redundant multi-line network. It sends it down a single aqueduct. The Haweswater Aqueduct runs about 110 kilometres, from the reservoir in Cumbria through Lancashire, all the way to the North Manchester Treatment Works in Greater Manchester. It was built between 1933 and 1955, which makes the oldest parts of it roughly 90 years old and the newest parts around 70. It is gravity-fed, which is elegant. The water falls about 250 meters over its whole length and needs no pumping. It simply flows downhill the entire way. Most of that journey happens underground, through 6 major tunnel sections that together run more than 50 kilometers, the longest single tunnel stretching 16.6 kilometers through solid rock. And down that one aqueduct flows around 570 million liters of water every single day, enough to fill well over 200 Olympic swimming pools, supplying about 2.5 million people across Cumbria, Lancashire, and Greater Manchester. That is nearly 5% of the entire population of England drinking from one pipe. Now think about what that means. Those 6 tunnel sections are single-channel tunnels. In most of their length, there is no parallel backup line running alongside, no second pipe waiting to take over. It is one route, and that one route is now reaching the end of the working life its builders designed it for. When engineers finally got inside to inspect it properly, in surveys done in 2013 and again in 2016, they found exactly what you would expect from hand-dug tunnels approaching 80 years of service, real degradation, and a real risk of failure in sections, with consequences that would be severe for the water supply of millions. One stretch near Kendal, at a place called Hallbank, was found to be in bad enough shape that United Utilities could not wait for the rest of the work. They replaced that 2-kilometre section ahead of everything else, between 2019 and 2020, tearing out the single old pipe and laying 4 separate pipes in parallel so that in future one could be shut down while the others kept the water moving. And here is the detail that tells you how tight the margins really are. To inspect this aqueduct at all, to take it offline even for a few weeks, United Utilities first had to spend roughly £190 million on a separate east-west link, completed in 2012, just to be able to move water across from the Liverpool side of their network to cover Manchester, while the main pipe was switched off. That is how dependent the system is on this one line. They had to build a workaround simply to be allowed to look at it. So let me put this plainly, because this is the part that the calm refilled lake hides. A reservoir is a savings account. In a normal year, more water flows in from the fells than the city draws out, and the account stays healthy. In a dry year, you live off the balance, and that is fine, because the account was built with a cushion. But the entire Haweswater system, the reservoir and the aqueduct together, was sized and built for the Manchester of the 1930s and for the weather of the 1930s. The city has grown. The demand has grown. The single pipe has aged. And the climate that the whole thing was designed around has shifted underneath it. The cushion has not grown with any of those things. That is why this is not really a drought story. Drought is something that comes and goes, something that ends when the rain returns. This is an engineering story, and the engineering has been quietly outrun for decades. The water came back in 2026. The single 90-year-old pipe did not get any younger, and the climate did not get any cooler. If you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. We cover water systems, the engineering that cities are quietly built on, and the geography and climate stories behind the headlines, with the full picture you actually need to follow what is going on. Now, let us look at what 2025 actually did to this system, because the numbers are worse than the recovery makes them sound. 2025 was not a normal year in England. It was the sunniest and warmest year ever recorded for the country. The spring was the driest since 1893, going back well over a century. March alone was the driest March since 1961, and the summer that followed was the hottest on record, running about 1.69 degrees above the long-term average. The Lake District, which normally drowns in rain, simply stopped getting it. And because upland reservoirs like Haweswater are filled by rainfall running straight off steep, hard rock, rather than by slow groundwater, they empty fast. Just 2 or 3 dry months is enough. By late May, Haweswater and its sister reservoir, Thirlmere, the 2 big Lake District stores that feed Manchester, had both fallen below 50% full, against around 90% at the same time the year before. United Utilities became the first water company in the country to move to drought status, and the trigger was specifically the low level in Haweswater. By August, the reservoir stocks across the whole northwest sat at around 59%, when the normal level for that time of year is closer to 73%. The 62% at the top of this story is not an outlier. It is simply a snapshot of a system sliding through the low 60s on its way down in a single bad summer. And this was not just a Lake District problem. Across England, nearly 9 million people ended the summer under a hosepipe ban. Around 20% of the country's canal network had to close because there was not enough water to keep it flowing. In Yorkshire and the Pennines, some reservoirs fell to around 30%, barely a third full. And in the heat, demand did the opposite of what you would want, with customers in the northwest alone using an extra 70 million litres of water a day as people watered gardens and filled paddling pools in the sun. So picture the bank account again. You bring in $12,000 a year, but in a hot, dry year, your bills jump to $16,000. Then autumn arrives and hands you a $3,000 bonus in the form of heavy rain, and the balance climbs back up, and it feels like the crisis is over. But you did not fix anything. You still have one income stream, the demand is still rising, and the next dry summer is not an if, it is a when. A wet winter refills the reservoir. It does not add a second pipe, and it does not change the climate that produced the driest spring in 132 years. Now, zoom out one more step, because the stakes here are bigger than one reservoir level. Manchester is not a shrinking city. It is the heart of a growing conurbation, and its leaders are actively planning for more people, more housing, more business, all of which means more water. The Mayor of Greater Manchester has openly tied the city's future growth to the security of this exact water supply. And every drop of that growth is still planned to run, for now, through the same single aqueduct that engineers have already flagged as aging toward failure. That is a country-sized weak point dressed up as a local water story. And the cost of the system is not only measured in pipes and money, it is measured in what the valley has lost. Take the Golden Eagles. For decades, the crags above Haweswater, in a side valley called Riggindale, were the only place in all of England where a golden eagle lived. A pair first nested there in 1969, after the birds drifted south from Scotland, and over the years that followed, different pairs raised 16 chicks above the reservoir. The Royal Society for the Protection of Birds ran a dedicated eagle viewpoint, and thousands of visitors travelled across the country just to glimpse one bird wheeling over the fells. The last female died in 2004. The last male, alone on his territory for more than a decade, was seen for the final time in November 2015, and by the spring of 2016 he was gone, most likely simply of old age at around 19 or 20. With him, the last resident golden eagle in England disappeared. The same valley tells a quieter version of the same story underwater. Haweswater is home to the Shelly, a rare whitefish that has lived in these lakes since the last ice age and survives in only a handful of waters anywhere on Earth. As the reservoir has been drawn down and refilled, decade after decade, its swinging water levels have wrecked the fish's spawning grounds. The Shelly population at Haweswater fell from somewhere between 200 and 550 fish in the early 1970s to fewer than 20 by the late 1990s. The drowned village was the first thing the valley gave up for the city's water. It was not the last. And there is one more piece, the slow-moving one that ties it all together. England has gone decades without building a major new water supply reservoir. The big projects belong to another era. Meanwhile, the Environment Agency is blunt that droughts are going to become more frequent and more severe as the climate keeps shifting, and that the uplands of the north and west, exactly where Haweswater sits, are the most exposed to the short, sharp droughts that empty a reservoir in a single dry season. So you have a city that is growing, a single aging pipe it cannot easily live without, a reservoir that swings to half empty in one hot summer, no major new storage being added, and a climate that is loading the dice toward more summers like 2025. That is the math. underneath the calm water. This brings us to the deadline that is already here. United Utilities knows the aqueduct cannot be left as it is, so it has launched one of the largest water infrastructure projects ever attempted in the Northwest. The Haweswater Aqueduct Resilience Program, known as HARP. The plan is to replace all 6 tunnel sections along the entire 110-kilometer route, building more than 50 kilometers of brand new tunnel through national park, open country, and dense city, all while keeping the water flowing the whole time. The estimated cost runs to around £3 billion. The new tunnels are being designed to last 120 years, and here is the timing that matters. The main construction is only starting in 2026, and the new sections are not expected to be fully online until around 2030. So for the rest of this decade, while the rebuild grinds forward, 2.5 million people will keep drinking through the same tunnels that engineers already labelled as nearing the end of their lives. It is a race, plainly. Rebuild the pipe before the old one fails, and rebuild it before the next record-breaking summer drains the reservoir behind it. Nobody can make it rain on demand. Nobody can make a 90-year-old tunnel young again. The only move left is to rebuild faster than the system ages, and to hope the weather holds while they do it. So where does this leave Haweswater? The dam itself will stand for a very long time. It is a wall of 44 concrete buttresses locked into a Cumbrian valley, built to outlast everyone who remembers what it drowned, and it is not going anywhere. The aqueduct will, in time, be rebuilt, and when HARP is finished, Manchester's water will run through modern tunnels with a century of life ahead of them. But a reservoir is only as safe as the margin around it, and right now, that margin is roughly 1 aging pipe and 1 wet winter wide. The level recovered. The structural problem did not. The single line still carries a city. The climate still leans toward drought. And every time the rain stops for a few months, the water drops back down the canyon of the dam. The pale tide mark climbs the shore, and the walls of Mardale Green rise once more out of the mud, a drowned village surfacing to remind a growing city just how thin the line really is. The water is back above 62% today. The question was never whether it would fall again. The question is whether the new tunnels are finished before it does.